Chapter 2 Part 1 They were leaving the city behind. First, the shopping centres and retail stores had given way to condensed suburban microlots, the inbred modern facades complemented by tight Roman lawns and flowering shrubs. Then the walled estates gradually became less frequent as the highway sloped upwards toward the line of lazy green hills that made up the Darling Ranges. The properties became larger. Tall roofed Federation houses sat on their half-acre blocks, sprouting grand trees and wild-looking hedges. Watching out of the car window, Vivian suddenly felt very far from home. Again, I am sorry about the court decision. Francis slapped back on the seat. God, what a jerk. It's like the kids for cash scandal all over again. She looked over at Vivian beside her. I'm not going to lie to you. I've read about where you're going. She hesitated. It's kind of old-fashioned. It's an orphanage, Vivian murmured. I know what that is. You think I can't do a web search? He saw her nod. Well, this one doesn't have the best reputation, either. Vivian grunted. His gaze followed the trails of raindrops crawling across the glass. What else did your web search tell you about it? Francis asked. Not much, Vivian admitted, except that it's old and a real shithole. Francis barked out an unladylike guffaw before catching herself and placing a hand over her mouth. My, she giggled. You certainly inherited your father's language. At mention of his father, a tide of anger rose up inside Vivian, smothering the emptiness that had filled him since the accident. She didn't have the right to talk about his dad, to laugh about his dad. None of them did. He had heard about his dad as much as he could stand in the previous days, and none of it was true. Francis seemed oblivious to this as she reached forward and laid one hand on the knee of his Levi's. This is just a step back, okay? I'm going to get you out of there, okay? Vivian looked down at her hand and felt his own uncurl. He hadn't noticed until now how tightly he'd been gripping the two rings in his palm. They had left a deep figure 8 in his flesh. Don't bother, he murmured, moving his knee out of her reach. And don't talk about my dad. Francis shifted back awkwardly. Right, she said. Sorry. Carefully balancing her knapsack on her lap, she unzipped it and slid out a clipboard. Any more headaches? She said, clicking a pen with her thumb. No. How about memory? She probed. Any gaps since the hospital? No gaps. Vivian countered in an annoyed tone. My memory's fine. Vivian, these questions are just routine, Francis reminded him with a sideways glance. Dr. Wasaki asked me to report any signs of... Damn it! The anger rose in him again, and now he looked at her. Yesterday was Monday. Last week was the last week of summer. I was in hospital then. He saw her wince at that, and it made him glad. Your name is Francis. You're 25 or something. You work for government health, and you were Mum's friend. See? He pointed at the side of his head. Nothing wrong with my memory. She tried to answer, but he cut her off. I know why you're asking this, he snarled. They want to know if my story has changed, don't they? Well, it hasn't. You've just been in an accident, she said in a patient tone. You were in shock. The psychologist thinks what you saw might not have been accurate. He's a doctor who works for the police and tells it the way they want to hear. Vivian snorted. My story hasn't changed one bit. There's nothing wrong with my memory. There was a roar of engines behind them as a truck rocketed past, its large wheels hurling a wave of dirty water against the window on Francis's side. Startled, she jumped, knocking her knapsack off her lap. As it fell, Vivian saw a mobile phone squeeze through the open zip like a silver tongue and drop into the footwell. Something familiar about it tugged at him. Listen, Francis struggled to regain her knapsack and her composure. I know your case was handled poorly to begin with. Her hand groped blindly for the phone. Someone should have been there to hold back the vultures, but by the time I heard about what happened to Charlie... She caught herself. I mean your mum. By the time I knew what happened to you, they had already moved you out of intensive care. That's just an excuse. Vivian shook his head. I know you're angry. Francis grunted, locating the phone and picking it up. You have every right to be, but a word of advice, if I may. Focus on what's coming. It's going to be tough in there. This place, the kids that live there will... She looked at the phone. It seemed to glow in her hand as she turned it over next to the window. Well, they're a lot like you. No one's like me, Vivian growled. I didn't mean it that way. Francis sounded nervous. I'm just saying they've been through a lot, and they might not be friendly towards you at first. Vivian fixed his attention on the phone she was holding, and his eyes widened. He'd seen the sticker on the back of its silver case 100 times before when his mother held it. A sticker of a left-leaning lightning bolt, red over blue, the lightning bolt of Ziggy Stardust. Joy and pain lanced through him at the same time as he stared at the faded symbol. "Do you understand what I mean?" Francis continued glancing at him. Vivian didn't answer, his focus completely drawn to the device in her hand. His immediate impulse was to ask for it, to have this piece of his mother back. But he hesitated. He didn't want Francis to know how much power she was holding over him. What if she wanted to control him, to force him to cooperate like the others had? No, he wouldn't accept that. He promised himself not anymore. "I just want you to be careful." Francis followed his gaze to the phone. Maybe, Vivian gambled, she was intending to give it up anyway. Why else would she have it with her? He returned his attention to the world outside his window, but used the glass to watch her reaction. To his dismay, Francis slipped the phone into her pocket, saying, "And no bad behavior, please. It'll only complicate matters." "I can handle myself," Vivian muttered, angry at the denial. "You handle finding out who the other driver was." Francis looked up at the roof, perhaps in frustration. Then pushing her clipboard and knapsack aside, she looked at him hard. It was not a glare. There was no anger in it, but it was intense. Vivian shrunk a little under her sapphire gaze, feeling his cheeks grow hot. "What happened to us, Vivian?" she asked, without scolding, which was somehow worse. "We used to be pals, didn't we?" A sharp jet of shame extinguished the flames inside him, and all thoughts of the phone vanished from Vivian's mind. "I guess. Kind of." He tried to look away, but she placed a soft hand under his chin like his mother had done on occasion. A part of him bristled at this and wanted to slap it away, but there was something about those eyes and that smell of vanilla and apples that made his stomach grow warm. He felt shy and embarrassed. "Look at me," she said, and he did. "I believe what you saw, and I will try to get you some answers. And if you don't believe that I would do it for you, then at least believe I would do it for your mum. But just remember, I'm a social worker, not an investigator. I have no legal grounds to go poking around police business. If I'm found out, my job is gone. My career is gone. So give me some time to do it my way, okay?" Vivian nodded, and when she removed her hand, his gaze dropped down to his knees. His face and cheeks were burning. Part 2. The car's GPS suddenly pinged. Francis reached forward and spoke quietly to the transport officer who was driving. The silver Toyota left the highway and turned left down a side road. Vivian looked out the window again and saw that they had passed, without his noticing, into farming country. Orchards and vineyards lined the rolling green slopes in neat rows, their summer fruit long gone as winter approached. The road narrowed to a single lane with no marked lines, and after several minutes of careful driving, the Toyota slowed and made another left turn. They passed through a crumbling brick portal flanked on both sides by arched rusted gates and adorned by a crown of metal letters spelling the name of an estate. Murkwater Downs. Gravel cracked and popped against the tires as the car wound along a driveway that snaked through a wood of gnarled, leaning trees. Vivian shuffled forward until the tip of his nose pressed against the cold glass, staring at the trunks gliding past them. From circling roots to the curling tips of branches, the trees that lined the road were bent, coiling over themselves in curls and florals that remind Vivian of cinnamon scrolls. Living wood warped itself like pale grey wax as it bent to the force of a cruel hand. All Vivian could do was stare as the bizarre landscape slid past his window. Frances tapped away at her own phone, apparently not noticing the change of scenery, and only looked up as a roar of heavier rain droplets began to pelt the car. The temperature inside the cab dropped noticeably, and the windows began to fog up. Francis called to the driver to use the demister, and Vivian rubbed on his window glass with the sleeve of his hoodie. He froze in surprise. A large dog was sitting among the leaves on the side of the gravel, like a cream-coloured letterbox. Ignoring the rain that battered its solid frame, the golden retriever appeared to be watching the car as it approached. At first, Vivian thought the dog to be an ornamental statue of some sort, but the animal dispelled this by turning its diamond-shaped head, tracking the car as it rumbled by, and Vivian was almost certain that he saw its feathered tail give a brief wag. Speechless, he followed the dog with his gaze, twisting in his seat to watch it out of the rear window. He waited several moments until they were well ahead, then turned and trotted back into the twisted woods out of sight. Vivian was about to ask Francis if she had seen the dog when he felt the car slowing. The tunnel of trees fell away into a wide clearing. "Oh my," whispered Francis. The grandiose space that lay before them was reminiscent in symmetry and balance of a royal European garden. The gravel driveway split into an upper and lower tiered figure 8 pattern, circling the lower half, an oval-sized space of brown rotting grass before climbing to the second tier. On the far side of the oval, a grand set of steps climbed the middle of the terrace slope to the second circular lawn, smaller than the first and guarded by a huge oak tree. Its autumn canopy mushroomed out in all directions, but like the rest of the surrounding trees, its shape was bent and twisted, slowly surrendering to whatever malignancy gnawed on the landscape. From there, worn dirt paths snaked their way through overgrown bushes, leading to the entrance of a monstrous brick and stone building. "Pretty fancy," Vivian said with a sneer, but had to admit to himself he was impressed. Tall and decorated with exquisite mouldings, the building's blackened walls told testimony of a once magnificent facade that was now mould-covered and sagging with age. Dark, oriel windows peered out from beneath the heavy lids of central balconies, giving the building an exhausted look. In some places, cracks in the masonry had been overrun with now dead vines of creeper, which climbed the walls like an unkempt beard. For all its imposing grandeur, Murkwater was no longer the jewel it must have once been. Vivian waited for the car to roll to a complete stop before opening the door and sliding out into the autumn shower. Ignoring the raindrops pelting the shaved back of his head, he moved around to the rear of the car and opened the boot. The duffel bag felt like it was filled with cement as he dragged it over one side of the space, and it took most of his strength to lift it over the lip. It fell onto the gravel with the clunking and clanking of a collapsed tent. Vivian sighed with regret. Until the authorities decided when he could go back to his parents' apartment, this collection of odds and ends was all he had. He tugged one of the handle straps, testing the weight. The bag resisted. Digging in his heels, Vivian began to drag it around the car. Frances was just getting out and holding her knapsack over her head to shield off the rain. "No need to get wet, Miss Basher," a low voice murmured behind them. A man, Vivian guessed to be in his 60s, stood at the base of some stone steps holding an umbrella over a naked scalp ringed with a horseshoe of greying hair. He reminded Vivian of Statler, one of the two old guys from the Muppet Show. Thick caterpillar brows crawled over a grey sagging face, with owl-like eyes so wide and unblinking they seemed in danger of drying out. He wore a grey suit neither cheap nor remarkable, and his brown shoes and matching tie spoke volumes to Vivian of a man that preferred to be in the background or at least have a desk between himself and others. Vivian smiled inwardly at this assessment. He had encountered 2 school principals of similar substance, and found them for the most part to be pushovers. They usually ignored his mischief rather than intervene, because intervening meant having to actually make an effort. The man's portly frame moved forward, carrying an inexplicable stoop, and swept an arm toward the inviting warmth of the car's interior. "Please," he said to Frances, "remain in comfort. I believe we can conduct whatever interaction is necessary if you simply lower your window." Frances eyed the gesture, and then the man, before extending her free hand in greeting. "Mr. Gorgon, I presume. I didn't expect that the dean of the orphanage would be meeting us out here. A somewhat informal spot." Mr. Gorgon looked at her hand, and then withdrew his arm to his side. His eyes moved to the rain splashing against her leather knapsack, and his mouth twitched with the briefest of smiles. "Informal but traditional," he said. "A long-lived courtesy at Murkwater. The residing dean always meets the new resident on arrival." He took a step back, but did not offer his umbrella to either Frances or Vivian, who stood off to the side shivering. "How kind," Frances said, flourishing a grin but dropping her own hand. "We spoke on the phone. I'd like to accompany this boy inside and make sure he gets settled accordingly. There's also the matter of how long he'll be staying." Another twitch of the mouth as the dean shook his head. "That won't be necessary. I've already spoken directly to His Honour Judge Mullins and determined that at least 6 weeks will be necessary, if not longer." 6 weeks? Frances blinked. "I hardly think 6 weeks is the minimum duration for residents here at Murkwater," the dean cut in. "The length of time was determined using the shortest stay on record as a baseline and was later approved by government-regulated authorities as the minimum. As you can imagine, the release of a child into the hands of an approved guardian is a complicated process with much paperwork. Frankly," he added with a slight lift of his caterpillars, "I'm surprised it was so quick, taking the sluggish nature of government processing into account." Frances ignored the barb in the comment. "Perhaps Vivian will become the new baseline." "I doubt it," Mr. Gorgon sniffed, wiping his rain-soaked hand on the bottom of his jacket. "It's the way things are here, and the way things have always been. Francis glanced at Vivian and then up at the monolith of Murkwater with its gatehouse facade, bristling crenellations and curvilinear gables. Narrowing her eyes, she pulled her dripping blonde strands back from her face. Well, I have my own way of doing things. It's called duty of care. I'm sure you're familiar with the term, and until I release my client into your custody, I have to insist on discussing matters with you inside, if you don't mind. Mr. Gorgon's stare spread into an indignant glare. That's highly irregular. Frances gave up trying to shield herself from the rain and wedged the knapsack under her arm. I'm an irregular girl, Mr. Gorgon. Moving up beside Vivian, she reached down and grasped the second duffel handle strap. It's this way, I assume, she said, and began helping Vivian drag the bag toward the leaf-strewn steps of the dais. Vivian looked up at her, surprised at her pluckiness, and she gave him a wink. He felt his cheeks grow warm again. The house rose above them like a black cliff, and in the highest windows, Vivian saw pale shapes in the darkness behind the age-stained glass, the shapes of children's faces, looking down at them from the gloom.